Welcome to our first virtual information session. We find ourselves in very different times. Each of us are doing our best to cope and thrive in these uncertain circumstances, but we're so very glad to be able to be with you here today virtually to share information about the Generation 26 Open Enrollment Charter School application. My name is Heather Mose, and I'm the Director of the Charter Authorizing and Administration Division here at TEA. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce some of my amazing team members. John, if you'll advance 2 slides, thank you. Drew Ann Wise is the manager of the New Schools team. John Garland is the coordinator. Natalie Elliott, coordinator of New Schools as well. Arnaldo Alanis is the assistant director and oversees the CSP grant. And Padma Satyanarayan is our financial compliance analyst. John, next slide. Today we're going to be presenting an overview of the Generation 26 application for charter, as well as expectations that we have for our charter operators and their governing boards. We've tried to set aside ample time at the end of each session to solicit questions and have built in additional time at the end of our presentation or time with you today for what we call an optional Q&A. I'm going to ask that you use the chat function to put your questions, the Q&A function to put your questions. As we stated in the instructions and guidelines, the Commissioner's aim is to attract high quality operators to the state's charter school portfolio. And to that end, we have structured today's agenda to provide you an application overview, highlight some lessons learned, provide you information on preparing and submitting your application, and request program information. We've asked experts from the agency to share their expertise with you this morning. We know that many of you have coworkers that don't respect boundaries and that some interruptions may be unavoidable. So if your furry coworker does interrupt you, we ask that you try to stay engaged with us, because I want to acknowledge the lofty endeavor that you are about to engage in with the state of Texas. So we ask that during our time together, you ensure that you are muted. I believe that we did mute everyone upon entry, but if you do become unmuted, make sure that you return to muted status. Minimize your distractions. As I said earlier, we recognize that we have not only co-workers, but other co-workers and sometimes school going on in our new circumstances. Remain engaged and attend to the presenters. Normally, we have had a 7-hour information session where folks have come to Austin and experts from the agency have presented. We've condensed and targeted our focus on the application today in our virtual setting to a 2.5-hour presentation with resource modules that you'll be required to watch separate from our time today. Again, I ask you to share questions you have in the question and answer panel and any feedback that you may have in the chat box. I want to remind you that all questions are valid. The more you know, the better your application is going to be. We have a couple of poll questions that we'll be asking throughout the presentation. And most important, we'll be sending your verification of attendance at the end of next week. This will need to be included in your application when you submit it, as well as the certificates that you'll need to download after you watch the modules that'll be posted after today's session. Also, we will be posting the FAQ questions, not only from today's session, but also last week's session as well. John, next slide. Our goal is to broaden your understanding of charter schools in Texas. The role of our office is to bring high quality charters to families who choose school choice. The Generation 26 application and its format and submission requirements are another goal for us to share with you so that you'll have a good understanding of all those components, including the financial workbook. We really feel that the more you understand the components of the application, the better you'll be poised to share the great things that you're going to do for Children of Texas if you're awarded a charter. We also hope to touch on various other requirements and then answer your questions. Next slide, John. Our office serves to support the Commissioner of Education in his role as the authorizer. Our role is to approve new charter schools, provide supports and resources to those charter schools and students, and to hold charter schools accountable. And John, I think I'm off one slide, so if you can advance one slide. Thank you. We maintain high standards and expect our portfolio to provide not only excellent, but equitable educational opportunities to all the students that choose to attend a charter school. Our mission in the authorizing office drives us to cultivate innovative, high quality learning opportunities for students and to empower our charter community through leadership, guidance, and support. And we also aim to have the strongest portfolio in the nation. Simply put, our role is to establish and maintain a system of high quality autonomous schools which provide excellent educational options for students and families. We have high standards for school performance. We aim to protect student and family rights and to guard the public interest as well. We believe that school leaders and teachers are best positioned to improve educational outcomes for students. Next slide. The vision for charter schools is outlined in the beginning of Chapter 12. Chapter 12, and I'll speak about that in just a moment, is where the charter school law lives. At the beginning of that section of the Texas Education Code, the first thing that is outlined is to improve student learning opportunities, increasing choice opportunities in the public school system, create professional opportunities to attract new teachers, establish a new form of accountability, and encourage different and innovative learning methods. I want to touch on a couple of these. While all of them are important, I want to focus on the first and the last. These two are really focused on improving the lives of students, improving student learning, and encouraging different and innovative learning methods. For those of you who have been in the classroom and have a history of working with students, you know our approach to student learning has to be as diverse as the students we teach. And so I think the legislators were right on target when they established this in 1995 as the focus. It's a bookend approach, if you will, to charter schools. John, next slide. This slide's intended to provide you a visual to support the historical narrative of charter schools in the state of Texas. As you can see, charter schools have been, as I just said, in a law since 1995. The first charter schools were approved by the State Board of Education the following year in 1996. And those charters we reference as our Generation 1 charters that opened their doors in 1997. The Texas charter school portfolio has grown a lot over the past 25 years. And from those first 20 charters that were awarded in 1996 to the current portfolio that we have of 180 charter schools serving over 700 charter campuses and over 300,000 students, you can see that it has been a quite interesting journey. Next slide, John. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, the school law bulletin, or the Texas Education Code, and because of my background, I don't know if you can see this as well, but this code is where the charter law lives. It's our Bible, if you will. The younger staff and on my team use the electronic versions, which are in this slide that are live links. But its inception was in 1995, as I was saying earlier, when the legislators outlined the purpose of charter schools and the true vision of what they saw this public school option being for students. In addition to the Texas Education Code, or excuse me, the School Law Bulletin, we have the Texas Administrative Code, and Chapter 100 provides the commissioner rules for charter schools. Those two sections of code are where we reference all the requirements for charter schools in our application, and for those charters that are operational within our portfolio. There are other areas in the education code as well that may apply. Specifically, those areas will point out open enrollment charter schools when those laws apply to them. But sometimes they often reference public schools, and there is an overarching umbrella application to charter schools. And that's because charter schools are public schools. Next slide, John. The contract, or maybe I shouldn't use the word contract, but the agreement, if you will, between the state and operators is to balance flexibilities and accountabilities, or autonomy and accountability. The state charter school law reduces regulations for charter schools. It encourages innovation and allows more flexibility. It also requires fiscal and academic accountability for charter schools, including the Charter School Performance Framework. In actuality, I often say that charter schools are held to higher stakes accountability than our traditional ISDs. We have, as I said, built-in autonomies that I'll get to in just a second, but both the academic financial accountabilities and the CSPF, or Charter School Performance Framework, are high stakes decision making, and you need to be aware of those. The law also maintains those flexibilities or autonomies to establish a student-teacher ratio. Flexibilities in regards to teacher certification requirements. There are a couple of exclusions that are covered in a module. Those would be special ed certifications, bilingual ESL certifications. The Chapter 21 requirements for contracts, minimum salary schedules, those don't apply. Chapter 37 as a whole does not apply. However, there are some exclusions that do specifically apply. When I was talking about the education code earlier, and I said, you know, the majority of the law lives in Chapter 12, but there are other sections of the code that might reference open enrollment charter schools, or might say this is applicable to all public schools. So we have some requirements that specifically outline in Chapter 37, and then some that are aligned to the law. If you bring a gun to school, there are certain consequences for that behavior. School calendar and start year are a big autonomy for charter schools, and admissions and enrollment. The admissions and enrollment piece is more aligned to each charter school's local policy. The last legislative session, there were some changes about the admissions form. The state now has a singular admission form that every charter school in our portfolio has to use. Your application should demonstrate that you're prepared to deliver on the promise of a better, more innovative education than a student would have received in a traditional public school. The balance of these autonomies and flexibilities hopefully will help you highlight your innovations. John, next slide. In terms of who is eligible to apply for an open enrollment charter school, also in the Education Code 12-101, the statute allows the commissioner the authority to grant a charter on the application of an eligible entity for an open enrollment charter school to 4 entities or categories, if you will. The first one, an organization that's exempt, a 501c3, that's a nonprofit entity. That is most likely the majority of you. That is the majority of our state's portfolio. We do have one governmental entity in our portfolio, a municipality, and we have some university charters or charters rather that are operating in conjunction with institutions of higher ed. If you think back to the slide that I showed you on the historical landscape of charters, when charters were first authorized in 1995, this was the law. Subsequent to that, there was an additional subchapter added to Chapter 12 that is specifically for university charters. So in the slide that you see before you, the top 2 buckets are usually the buckets that we see applicants applying. The bottom 2, although we have some in our portfolio or open enrollment portfolio that are sponsored by institutes of higher ed, the majority of those recently have been applying under subchapter E charters. Okay, next slide, John. So if approved, you'll be joining the 180 other charters in the portfolio. There's a cap on charter schools. That cap is 305. We are nowhere nearing that cap. I know in past years, not recent past, but distant past, there was a lot of angst about the fact that we were hitting that cap and the number of charter schools that we could award. The charter school, you need to know, is identified by a county district number, or what's referenced as a CDN. It is the same numbering convention that independent school districts are identified at. And if you're awarded a charter school, you will know that 6-digit number, or CDN, like it's the back of your hand. This 6-digit number is conferred to you upon the execution of your charter contract, and it becomes very significant to your organization, much like your EIN is right now. If you contact anyone at the agency, most oftentimes the first question they ask you is, what's your county district number? This is important because I often say, you know, we have in our portfolio 180 charters. There are some that I think my last count, there are 5 that have the name Excellence in it. There are 2 that have Legacy. And so we actually have some very similarly named charters. That county district number is unique, and once used, never used again. On that note, you can go to the TEA website and you can look at the Ask Ted link, and it'll pull up all the school districts and charter schools in the state. When you're naming your name, keep in mind that although your name, you might want to be excellent, excellent legacy. If there are 5 other excellent legacies, you might want to distinguish yourself somewhat differently. The other thing I will say to you, and usually I'm walking in front of you and I start talking at one side of the room and at the other side of the room. When choosing your name, when you call TEA, or when you are marketing your charter school, or putting it on a banner or letterhead, to have a name that is the excellent legacy of Lone Star, and it can't roll off my tongue like it is when I'm walking across the stage. But keep in mind the length of your name, because in addition to that CDN, you'll be asked, your school name every time you are engaging with the public, every time you are engaging with TEA. So who are we? John, let's go to the next slide and look at the demographics of our state. We hope that your demographics are similar to the demographics that the demographics in your proposal are appropriate reflection of the state and local demographics. I say that because when we read your applications and we see big discrepancies between the proposed area that you're proposing to open in and discrepancy between those demographics and the demographics you propose to serve, it causes us to question that. As you can see, our portfolio is reflective of the state in terms of serving a majority of Hispanic, Latino students. John, next slide. So I have some questions for you. There is no need to put your answers in the chat or in any way submit your answers, but I want you to sit back and test your knowledge. If you are with your team, you can maybe keep track of who's answering what questions correctly. So let's get ready for our true or false. I'm going to read a statement, give you a moment to think about it, and then we'll dig into that. All charter school teachers must be certified. Do you think that's true or false? John, next slide. So charter school teachers must hold a minimum of a baccalaureate degree, but you're not required to have certified teachers. There are a couple of exclusions though. As I mentioned earlier, special ed teachers, bilingual ESL teachers, and if you're proposing to serve a pre-K grade span, pre-K teachers must be certified. And that reference in the education code, the statute, is TEC 12-129. Our next question, there are 6 duties a governing board cannot delegate. 6 duties. Right now, your governing board should be answering, that is correct. Certain powers and duties cannot be delegated. We refer to these as the non-delegable duties. They are the responsibility of the board. Of particular note, I want to highlight the nature of the governing board having the authority to hire and fire, evaluate. The chief executive officer, The chief executive officer is the same as the superintendent, oftentimes referred to as the director, head director. We try to give you a lot of autonomy in the naming of whatever that role is, but there is one operational leader of your charter school, and that person reports to the board. In addition to that, the board must hear grievances. The board adopts and amends the budget, directs the disposition of records, adopts charter operation policies, approves annual audit reports, and as I mentioned earlier, hires and fires, evaluates the superintendent or the chief executive officer. Our next question, charter schools may teach Common Core standards. We put that in there because the answer is no. Texas is a non-Common Core state. It specifically is outlined in our Texas Education Code that our public schools will not teach the Common Core. Public schools in the state of Texas must teach the Texas essential knowledge and skills that excuse me, are explicitly stated in our statutory language. So when you are looking at your curriculum, be prepared to highlight how this is aligned to the Texas essential knowledge and skills. Okay, next question. Charter schools must accept all students who apply. I've had opportunities to present at House Pub Ed and Senate Education during legislative sessions and am often asked this question. I open my arms wide and say open enrollment charter schools are open to those students who apply. There are some exceptions, and I'm going to take a little bit of time to dig into those, but we want to make sure that all the students who meet the criteria can attend the charter schools in our portfolio. We do not cream, that's a term used for like picking and choosing the students that are going to attend our schools. We do not counsel students or families to go to another school. If a family comes to you and wants to enroll and they meet the requirements of their applying to attend a grade level that you serve, they are living inside a geographic boundary that you're approved by the Commissioner of Education to serve, you do not have a wait list because you're oversubscribed, so you have physical space. You're not a performing arts school, meaning you don't have auditions to attend your school. And the student does not have a documented history of criminal offense. Note criminal offense, juvenile court adjudication, or discipline problems. Before we go on, I'm going to dig into that last bullet, if you will. In the code, in the statutory provisions, the discipline problems are not meant for exclusion of students who may have tardy issues. Those are really put in the code to exclude students who might have much more offensive discipline histories. And when I say offensive discipline histories, possibly the student has a discipline history for bringing drugs to school, or one of those more penal code kind of violations, brought a knife to school. Those types of discipline problems, the reason this is in the code is because charter schools don't get facility funding. And so to house students separately in a DAEP fiscally is not something that charter schools are set up to do. So to address that, this provision was placed in the statute. It's not meant to prevent Heather Mose, who might have a history of tardies, from attending your school. That is not a discipline problem, even though I might have a discipline history of being written up for tardies. The other thing I want to highlight is the admission phase of the admission and enrollment is not the time that you ask any questions that would exclude students. Think of it like A is at the beginning of the alphabet, enrollment comes after A. So it's after you've determined that there is a spot for this student that then you get to ask questions about discipline histories. And that was part of the reason for the statutory change last legislative session for the state to create an admission form for all charter students that did not have any chilling effect on their admission to a charter school. Okay, next question. The Kardashians could serve on your governing board. In past presentations, I've had pictures of Duck Dynasty, the Kardashians, next slide, John. The Kardashians could not serve on your board. Charter schools are not family businesses. There is a nepotism law that was passed in 2013 that prevents families from running a charter school. A public officer cannot hire, select, appoint, confirm the appointment, vote on the hiring, et cetera, of an individual if the individual is related to you within the third degree of consanguinity, which is blood, or affinity, which is marriage. So 2 or more relatives within the third degree of consanguinity or affinity cannot serve together on the governing board, or cannot be employed by the charter holder or the charter school, if you will. There are no exceptions to this nepotism provision. And that Tracy will probably go over in her module, but that is, your spouse, child, parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, grandchild, great-grandchild, sibling, aunt, uncle, nephew, niece. Next slide, John. Charter schools must use the same student admission application. I actually gave this answer away earlier. Yes, all charter schools in the state's portfolio must use the Texas Charter Student Admission Application. We refer to it as the CSAA, CSAA. This is something that is posted on our website annually. This is something that if you are using a vendor to help with your admission process, your vendor needs to know about at the forefront. We have had a lot of stakeholder meetings where we've actually engaged with the various vendors that help charter schools with admissions. And this is a requirement for all charters, again, in the state's portfolio. Next question. Charter schools and traditional public schools, or ISDs, are held to the same disciplinary requirements. And you should know that answer as well. As I referenced it earlier, charter schools are not subject to the majority of the TEC. However, there are those that are apply or those exclusions. Charter schools are required to adopt a code that outlines the types of prohibited behaviors. This is something that, you should be thinking about. It is a requirement for all charters to have a local policy or student code of conduct that you share with your parents and your students. And it also should allow due process with respect to those incidences that would result in an expulsion of a student. Next question. Charter schools and traditional ISDs are funded in the same way. The answer to that is false. Like the primary source of funding for charter schools comes from the Foundation School Program. acronym that you will use if you're awarded a charter and start living in this land is FSP. So Foundation School Program is based on weighted average daily attendance, or WADA. Sometimes folks just refer to average daily attendance. The weighted aspect of that occurs because certain student groups have additional weights or funding associated with them. And WADA is a measure of the number and type of students attending your schools. Charter schools Tier 1 allotments are based on a small, mid-size average. And charter schools do not have local tax revenues. So we wanted to highlight some of the lessons that we have learned, some of the things that have positively impressed us, some of the things that in hindsight we wish we would have communicated to our applicants. And so let's dig into a couple of these. The first one, just sharing a little bit of my graduate school experience. The hardest assignment I had was when we had to create a district budget and determining who and what to pay for. And the big walkaway was salaries are the majority of your budget. On the HR forms in the application, it's always interesting to see how you allocate salaries and how those calculations were arrived at. 2 observations. I always have said that be sure to pay your PEIMS clerks or coordinators. These are not just attendance secretaries or registrars. The charter school's funding is very much dependent upon these individuals having accurate knowledge and coding of students. They should know what the student attendance accounting handbook, or what we reference as SAW, is. These folks enter your data and miss, if they're not on top of their codes, this could result in funds not being allocated to your school because students weren't accurately entered into PEIMS. One year, I saw an applicant, it's been several years now, but I saw an applicant propose to pay all their administrators at the upper level of their team $200,000 each. The enrollment for that charter school at capacity was listed at 250 students. While we have always said that in order to be financially viable, you have to have a minimum enrollment of about 250 students, paying your upper leadership or your C-suite $200,000 does not help you to be financially viable, while paying teachers severely less than the minimum pay scale. You do not have to follow pay scale, but when we start looking at how certain groups are funded, it's just important to stay focused on what's most important. So I guess actually the third observation, a couple of years ago, the most refreshing calculation we had, so on the page where we ask you to determine salaries, we saw a superintendent salary where they took the salary of the contiguous districts, which had pretty high enrollment numbers. They divided by that enrollment and arrived at a per pupil allocation. Then they took the average of the 3 per pupil allocations and multiplied that by their projected enrollment to arrive at a more equitable, reasonable salary scale for the superintendent. Next slide. This might seem like a no-brainer, but we have had charter schools that have been unable to secure locations, that have had to seek out leases with church facilities. And while nothing wrong with that, what we do have issue with is the students attending your charter school, if you're awarded, are attending a public school. And so it's important to be aware of the non-sectarian requirement. If you are having to lease from a church facility, that church facility should not have Jesus greeting you at the door, a stained glass window of a Star of David, a biblical verse or scripture on the wall in the hallways. This is, sectarianism is in essence could lead to some prejudice or discrimination, and we want to make sure that, like other public schools, charter schools are non-sectarian in all respects in the admission of their students, hiring of employees, instruction, iconography in a school facility, also on your school building, your school's name, your curriculum. We have had charter schools that have bought old churches and have had to paint bricks that were white among red brick wall that formed across. But be aware when you are working on securing your facility that some of the architectural structures cannot be changed. Technically, if there are any of those structures, they should be covered up during school hours. Okay, next slide, John. So David Letterman, for those of you who are my age, had the top 10 that he would have on his show. So we wanted to share some top 10 pitfalls to avoid. And those I want to emphasize, trying to really highlight the fact that there is an applicant code of conduct and plagiarism policy. Your work should be your own. There are several types of plagiarism on the spectrum of whole citations and what we call mosaic plagiarism, where you cut and paste a couple words here and there. If the work isn't yours, cite it. And if you have a team working on the application, make sure everyone knows about the plagiarism policy. We've had previous applicants who split up the application. Certain folks were working on different parts of the application. One of those, certain individuals copied the student code of conduct and bell schedule from an area school, didn't cite it, didn't think anything of it. That's plagiarism if it's not cited and if it's someone else's intellectual property right. We use web applications, a couple different web applications to check plagiarism. So if you're a returning applicant, please make sure that you cite any previous application, as our checker is going to identify the language as plagiarism since previous copies of applications are available on the web. And though not listed, it's important to note that we post the applications to the website, and any curriculum or curriculum copyrights, or those of you who are considering CMOs and have CMO agreements that are covered by copyright, those things have to be redacted. And if that redaction results in pages of black redaction, there's going to be undue interest, making you, should you advance through the process, have to answer questions about what's in the redacted pieces of your application. And so we really have found that to avoid making individuals wonder what you're trying to hide, if it's a CMO copyright agreement, talk to your attorney about that. Curricular copyright agreements can be talked about. I'm sorry, not the copyright agreement, but curriculum can be talked about and in essence summarized before listing out that specific curriculum. So you can talk about a certain curriculum as noted below, and then that kind of leads into, that's why that section is redacted. So let's talk about next steps. Oh, hold on. There are a couple of other things I did want to talk about. I know I emphasized the copyright material that's down at the bottom. I know that we are not having you bring in physically your applications to the agency this year because all of that we are going through as a community. So what we've tried to do is set up a system where you can submit your applications via post and electronically. Please don't wait for the last minute. I know there is a tendency for many of us in this virtual room to be perfectionists and want to check and double check, but waiting till the last minute and then experiencing a huge technological hiccup like I did last week when presenting at the info session is probably not something to do. So waiting until last minute to upload a mail is not something that we would recommend. The other things that number 5, failing to send impact statements to all required individuals. It is better to ensure that you have communicated with appropriate superintendents, legislators, and state board members. If you're going into a state board member's district, you'll want to have reached out to them to have some conversations beforehand. If nothing else, as a courtesy. We have also seen in the past that this has been a make or break item. Member who has not been, who is supportive of charters, but very measured in their support. It was actually something that they cited in comments when they said this applicant actually reached out to me early on. So make sure that your geo boundaries are correct and that you're contacting the folks in those geo boundaries correctly. Pisha is going to talk to you about the financial workbook. We recommend a conservative estimate on your enrollment and finances, overestimating enrollment, particularly right now. There is so much that is unknown. We are excited about your energy and your desire to make a difference in the lives of kids, but also need to know that we find ourselves in a very uncertain time. And then also under planning for special populations, that would be something. So I guess I worked up from 1 to 10 rather than 10 to 1, David Letterman style. Thanks, John. Next steps, we're going to have staff talking about the application and the various components. I want to remind you that once you receive the verification, please make sure you include that in your application submission, as well as the certificates that you'll be printing out once you have viewed the various modules that we've excluded from our live presentation today. And the final slide is something that I've always closed with. And this is really the slide where I put your feet to the fire. Our number one goal is illustrated in this slide. We want to make sure that parents who send their children to charter schools, those children have as many doors open as possible. These parents are oftentimes working hard to send their kids to a school where they're promised to get a better education and to have their child's needs met. So your job, if you're awarded a charter, is to ensure the students that are attending your school can walk through the door to college, can walk through the door to a job, can walk through the door to military or whatever future that they want to pursue. So they should have as many doors open for them as possible when they leave your classrooms. If you're attending this session, you're committed to providing the best possible education to children. If you're focusing on dropout recovery, wonderful. But be prepared to meet the academic needs of those students. Dropout recovery students are a very specific student group, and their needs are very specific. We've actually had folks who have told us after being awarded charter and received a grade that, an accountability rating that was less than what we would have hoped for, that these students are hard to serve. If you need to know your focus, it needs to be aligned with your mission and the program that you propose to serve. So if you don't have a well-rounded team with expertise in finance, education, curriculum, human resources, data systems, particularly now, record retention, find people who are, create a team, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're impacting children's lives and impacting their futures. And so with that, I wish you all the luck. You're in very capable hands of this team who is going to walk you through the application. Thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you. I know this is a lot of information, but thank you for remaining committed, remaining engaged. I really appreciate it.
Good morning again, and thank you for joining us. We have a few items to cover before we get started on the application overview. First of all, we have 124 attendees today on this webinar. So if you're attending on your own device, we have you down. You do not have to ask for verification. However, if you are attending via a phone number, I ask that you please submit your phone number with your name and the school, your proposed school name, to the Q&A so that we have a record of it. We cannot verify your attendance with a phone number alone, as we don't know the name associated with it. So if you'll do that, that will help us for your verification. And lastly, we've been asked several times about the presentations for today. We will be posting the presentations from today on our webpage, and we'll go over that in just a few moments. So now let's start the application overview. The natural first step to completing the Generation 26 application is accessing the application on the web page. We have redesigned the applicant web pages. So I'd like to walk you through the various pages and show you where you can find the necessary application components. From the charter school's main web page, click on the applicants link on the right-hand side of your screen. Once on the applicant's main page, in the top paragraph, you will see definitions of the various charter schools operating in Texas. We'll go over these a little later in the presentation. The three buttons in the middle of the page indicate the types of applications available for Generation 26. We have new operators, experienced operators, and college and university operators. At the bottom of the page, you'll notice several resources that will help you as you complete the application. The piggy bank is for the CSP Startup Grant. Here you will find helpful information when completing the Generation 26 applications, as we have embedded the CSP Startup Grant application within the Gen 26 application. The next icon is for the public meeting calendar. This is where we will keep a running list of all required public meetings. John will go over this item in a few minutes. The next button is the Opportunity Zone Locator. This resource will also help you as you complete the CSP Startup application in the addendums document. Arnold is going to touch on this in his presentation. Following that is the Charter School Governance button. We have provided a governance resource for you. And finally, we have the FAQs icon. We will be updating this document with questions and answers from the Generation 26 information sessions, as well as additional questions that are emailed to us. Currently, the document is based on last year's Gen 25 questions. So some of the information presented today may be different than what's in the current document. Now, let's look at the various applications available. We'll start with the new operator application. If you hover over the various applications, such as the new operator button, a definition will pop up. The definition in the new operator says, if you are a new operator who has never operated a charter school before, this is the application that you will complete. Let's click on this button. As the new operator page opens, you will see 3 buttons. Application timeline. This is an overview of the important dates within the Generation 26 application process, and it's also available in the instructions and guidance document. The second button is the mandatory information sessions button, which you're already familiar with as you are attending today. However, I want to point out that later today or early next week, we will be posting mandatory presentations with accompanying certificates of participation, which you must view. We will also post presentations from today as additional resources. We've had a lot of questions about that, and so please, if you want to view the presentations from today, they will be found under the additional resources. And then finally, we have the application documents button. This is where you will be most interested. Here you will find all of the application components that you will need to complete the Gen 26 new operator application. First is the application instructions and guidance document. Without this document, you will not be able to complete the application as the actual questions are included here. Let's take a brief look. You have instructions, table of contents, and then the questions follow. A lot of the questions that have come in today will be answered in the instructions and guidance document. Next, we have the application responses and attachments document. This is where you will insert your answers to the questions in the previous document, answer specific questions, and insert required attachments. John, will you open up that document?
Sorry, Drew, it is a Word document, and because of the screen share capabilities within the webinar, it won't be able to display for them, but it is a Word document, and you just fill it out as if you were going to fill out a normal Word document.
Okay, thank you. The next 2 buttons are the additional attachments and addendum documents. Please note, you will have to download the documents within these PDFs and save to your computer in order to complete them. Next, you have the letter of special assurances. And then finally, you have the scoring rubric. Natalie's going to review which documents are included in the submission, as well as outline the components of the scoring rubric later in our presentation. Also, please notice the section at the bottom on troubleshooting called Errors When Opening Files. Refer to this section if you have any problems opening the files. Also notice we have included the links to the various resources at the bottom of this page as well. So each of the application pages is essentially the same except for the rubrics. Let's look at the experienced operator page. Again, if you hover over it, it'll give you the definition of experienced operator. If you click on it, you'll have the three same buttons that you had with the new operators. Let's look at the application documents button. All of the components are the same. The only difference is the scoring rubric. And some of the application responses and attachments are different in that document for experienced operators. Thank you, John. If we return to the slide deck, again, the available applications are new operator for eligible entities that have not operated a charter before, experienced operator, new operators with out-of-state CMO affiliation. These are eligible entities with a history of operating high-quality charter schools under a different authorizer. Out-of-state operator serves as the CMO. Or they are also Texas entities that operate a district authorized charter campus in Texas with multiple years of academic performance data. And then finally, you have the public college and university application. This is for public junior colleges, public senior colleges, public universities. Next slide, please. Let's look at the various parts of the application one more time. The application instructions and guidance document will answer a lot of the questions we've received today in the Q&A function. The application responses and attachments document is where you submit your narrative responses and your attachments. The additional attachment forms are PDF versions, and you must download them to your computer and save it in order to complete. The addendums document contains the charter management organization and your CSP as well. Arnold's going to cover the CSP in a few minutes. Your letter of special assurances, and then the scoring rubric, which is different for new operators and experienced operators. Natalie will be going over the assembly of parts in just a bit. And now, John is going to present some specific terms and concepts for you.
Thank you, Drew. All right. So I want to go over some important terminology and key concepts that applicants can sometimes find a little confusing. So this first slide is we're going to talk about the school board and the sponsoring entity. And Heather talked about this, but I just want to elaborate a little bit. So let's talk a little bit. The sponsoring entity that you've already formed or you will form by the application due date will become the charter school board if you're ultimately awarded a charter. They are one and the same. Thus, it is important to choose individuals who will be prepared to govern a school and all the obstacles that come with that responsibility. And on that note, we do get asked a lot, well, can the board allocate specific governing roles to a subsidiary or a secondary board? And as Heather already mentioned, the short answer is no. The sponsoring entity does not establish a secondary governing board to run the school. However, as this slide does indicate, you may establish a secondary advisory board. Advisory boards do not vote or make formal decisions on the governance of the school. They are only there in a purely advisory role. It's also important to note that charter school board members are not compensated for their work. And I know that's a little bit difficult to wrap your mind around because I know a lot of you sitting in your chairs today, this endeavor is actually born from your idea and your desire to create those high quality educational opportunities that Heather was mentioning earlier. And naturally, you would want some degree of compensation for that. However, you cannot be on the board and be involved in the governance of the school and also be a paid employee of the school at the same time. As Drew mentioned, as a required online resource, you will have to review all of the presentations, one of which is the legal division presentation outlining those selected legal topics that affect charter schools. And within that presentation, and as we've already mentioned, you will find those non-delegable duties that all charter schools, must follow. And for our purposes today, just know that the school board cannot delegate any legal responsibilities to a third party. The individuals that are on the board within the application that you submit on January 20th will become legally responsible for the governance of the school if you're awarded. So lastly, I wanted to briefly show you the chain of authority that typically flows from the board. So as you can see, the board hires and fires a superintendent, and then that superintendent will hire and fire the charter school staff. And I also wanted to note that the contracts with vendors, service providers, charter management organizations, et cetera, are only approved and terminated by the board. So let's go to the next slide. Another big question we get is, are we applying for a charter school, or are we applying for each campus that we want? And the short answer is you are applying for a charter school. In many ways, you could think of the term school within the charter realm to be kind of synonymous with the district level. So within that charter school and your charter application, you may apply for one or more campuses. Now, please note that all campuses that you propose will operate within the approved geographic boundary, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. I did want to highlight for a really, really brief moment this concept of expansion. While this does not affect you as an applicant at this stage, it is important to note that the number of campuses that you propose within your application on January 20th will be final until you are eligible for an expansion request. For our purposes today, it's only necessary to understand that a campus expansion request will not be available to you until at least 3 years into operations. And more importantly, that request is tied and subject to accountability ratings. So what you need to walk away from with this on expansion is that it's important to give thought to the number of campuses necessary to accomplish your mission and vision. Because once you submit your application, that is what we will consider as what you've deemed to be necessary for your goals and dreams. Okay, let's talk about geographic boundaries. I think this is a topic of common confusion, and so let's spend a little bit of time on it. So unlike traditional school district, charter schools enroll and receive funding for students within what we call a defined collection of traditional school district boundaries. It's extremely important to note that geographic boundaries are at the charter school, or as I said, district level, meaning individual campuses that you will propose under that charter do not have their own geo boundaries. It's rolled up to the charter or district level. Now that said, applicants can typically propose 1 or 2 boundary models, as this slide shows. So some applicants will opt for a traditional school boundary, and where students within that geo boundary are enrolled on a first come, first served basis. So as an example, let's just say the geographic boundary for charter ABC is John ISD, Drew Ann ISD, and Natalie ISD. So in a traditional model, any student within John, Drew Ann, or Natalie ISD would be enrolled on a first come, first served basis, regardless of which district any of those students reside. Other applicants, on the other hand, choose a primary secondary boundary model. And as the slide indicates, a primary boundary can be a school district, a zip code, a street highway configuration. Students who reside within that primary boundary would be enrolled first. Then, if students who reside within the secondary boundary are enrolled only if there are available seats after that primary boundary's enrollment period ends. And I know that's a bit confusing, so I urge you, if you don't understand that, please insert a question in the Q&A. We've allotted that 30 minutes at the end of the session today, and we can go into it a little bit more. All right, so I also want to talk a little bit about the statement of impact package, because we get that a lot, like, well, what do we send with that exactly? So this package, the Statement of Impact package, is a formal opportunity to inform potentially impacted school districts and other elected officials about your application. And that said, the package has three main documents that you're going to send: the cover letter and the Statement of Impact form, and both of those are accessed on the additional attachments document that Drew Ann previewed earlier. Applicants must also include the applicant cover sheets within the package. And those are pages 9 through 11 of the responses and attachments document. So when you open that document, you'll fill out pages 9 through 11. Those are the pages that you sign and send with the other two forms. And then lastly, you must send this package via certified mail. The attachment section of the responses and attachments document outline that process for providing proof that those packages were mailed properly. And you'll also note, and I want to be very clear about this because we get this question a lot, you are not responsible as an applicant for their response. What you are responsible for and what the application requires is that you send it in a timely manner and you send it to the accurate mailing address. What happens after that is up to the recipient. That is not up to you. So you do not need to prove that they received it other than what is outlined in that attachment cover sheet. Okay. Last, I wanted to conclude on the public meeting. It's a big part of the application process and it's gone through a couple changes since last year. So let's dig in a little bit. All applicants must conduct at least one public meeting to fulfill the application requirement. However, and I want to stress this, however, nothing prevents an applicant from actually hosting multiple meetings. To meet the application requirement, you just have to have the one meeting. Historically, these meetings were required to be in person. However, due to circumstances, this year we are allowing virtual and/or in-person meetings. But we do say that if you conduct in-person meetings, that you obviously uphold all proper social distancing procedures and in an otherwise safe manner. So, looking at the slide, once you've selected your venue, you will have to post an announcement in a printed publication of wide distribution. Now, I'm sure 90% of you right now are asking yourself, what is wide distribution? So typically we are referring to, I would say, a citywide subscription publication. I think you could think Dallas Morning News, Austin Statesman, Houston Chronicle. Those would just be examples. But it's also important to note that you may publish your notice in the classified section. I get a lot of calls asking if you have to put in the legal notice section. No, I know there's a substantial pricing difference between the two, so classified section is fine. Another point I wanted to address is when we have these in person, a lot of times people come up to me and say, hey, we know of online or local publications that are not necessarily widely distributed or not in print, and they'd be more effective to alert our respective communities and projected demographics. I'm going to say this again. The requirement is that you post in a widely distributed publication that distributes in print, but there's nothing to prevent you from hosting other meetings where you do use those local and online publications. Okay, and then lastly, about a couple other points actually about this process. So applicants must also email all the individuals outlined in attachment 6 within 5 business days of each meeting. Last year, we'd recommended 10 business days. This year, we are formalizing and codifying that you have to notify that email within 5 business days. And then the last 2 pieces of the process are that you will have to provide proof of a formal agenda and a question protocol. And that protocol is either a script or a list of questions that will be and were asked during each meeting. And again, if you look at the responses and attachments section, there are attachment cover sheets that outline requirements for each of those. And that concludes my section. I'm going to kick it on over to Natalie to talk a little bit about the scoring and evaluation process. Take it away, Natalie.
Thanks, John. Now let's briefly discuss the steps for assembling and submitting your finalized application. First, you're going to print the responses and attachments document, taking care that all narrative responses are addressed in single-spaced type. Then, Print the attachments document and attachment cover sheets, including any addenda and the letter of special assurances that is initialed and signed by the board president in blue ink. You must insert all attachment documents behind their corresponding cover sheets and include all of these at the end of the narrative responses document and the addenda after those, followed by the letter of special assurances last. Please keep the attachments in order and number the pages accordingly. From here, you'll want to print and scan the entire submission. You must submit the digital version of the application to our division's share file, which must be received by the close of business on January 20th. Additionally, you are still required to mail to TEA 2 hard print copies of the entire application via a standard shipping service like USPS or FedEx, and these must be postmarked by January 20th. As iterated before, in-person submissions are not accepted. One of these print copies must have a signature in blue ink from the CEO of the sponsoring entity or the application contact. Please know that we are working on a method to confirm receipt with applicants when we have received your applications. Now, as to the scoring and review process that begins after application has been verified for completion. Please know that TEA does not score the applications. That is done by highly qualified external reviewers. Each application that is deemed complete is scored by 5 different reviewers. Each section of the application receives a separate score on the rubric, all of which are totaled for the reviewer's score. The 5 separate scores are then averaged together, dropping the highest and lowest reviewer scores. Whichever is higher between this adjusted score and the average score is then taken. We are looking for averages that are 85% or higher. In the event that an application has an average score that lands between 80% or 84%, that application will be sent to a 6th reviewer for an additional score. To illustrate the overall review process, we have this helpful graphic. The applications are first reviewed internally, just to determine completion, or if any items are needed to determine completion. Then the external review, as just discussed. Next, the highest scoring applications will be internally reviewed by TEA staff in preparation for the capacity interviews. Then the interview will take place, after which the Commissioner of Education will recommend certain charters for approval. After this, the State Board of Education will convene and vote with the option to veto any of the recommended charter awards. Once a charter contract is granted, the schools in this cohort, for instance, would open in the fall of 2022.
So sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. I apologize. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you everyone for joining this part of the process and the webinar. Drew Ann, are we going to just go right into Arnold's, or do we have time for the 5-minute Q&A?
I think we will go on into Arnold's presentation and we will address any questions that come up in the Q&A function during the 30 minutes.
Sounds like a plan. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Arnoldo Alanis, who will talk to you all about the CSP grant, and he has a wonderful presentation in store for you. Arnold, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you, John.
All right, let's get into it.
All right, I'm going to set my timer to make sure I don't go over that 30 minutes. It is set now. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Arnoldo Alanis. Go by Arnold to make it a little bit easier. And I'm going to speak to you about the Charter School Startup Grant, Charter School Program Startup Grant. Want to just kind of say, I know I've spoken with some of you this week and turned you on to the registration links. So it was good to see those names registered for this event. So welcome again. And Heather already kind of gave introductions about who works, you know, with the application for charter and stuff. And I figured I'd pass along the same information on who works with our Charter Schools Program Startup Grant. Heather Mose is the director, and you've already heard from her. And then you've got myself. I am the assistant director in the division, but I'm also the grant project director. So I work very closely with the U.S. Department of Education on administering this grant at the state level. Melissa Giesberg is our right-hand person. She's the senior research specialist in the division and works most closely with the data associated with reporting requirements for this grant. And Paul Michaels is our grant manager, and he works at TEA, but in another division, the Division of Grants Administration. So those are the key players that we have working with this particular federal grant. What we're going to go over in our presentation this morning are some session goals. We want to discuss the purpose of the Federal Charter Schools Program. We want to discuss who is eligible to apply for this grant. We're going to discuss allowable uses of funds and unallowable uses of funds. And then we're going to get into just a brief, for a brief moment, the CSP Startup Grant Addendum. So purpose of the Charter Schools Program as outlined in the federal notice inviting applications for TEA to be able to apply for this grant is to extend, and again, this is at the federal level, expand opportunities for all students, particularly traditionally underserved students, to attend public charter schools and meet challenging state academic standards. That's very similar to kind of the purpose for putting out a charter application too. Ultimately though, the big ticket item is to provide financial assistance for the planning, program design, and initial implementation of charter schools, and to increase the number of high quality charter schools available to students across the United States. And so if you just take out the United States part of it, we're trying to do those three things here in Texas with this application process and with the CSP grant funds. So who is eligible to apply? And again, this is eligibility as it ties directly to the U.S. Department of Education. So an eligible applicant means a developer that has applied to an authorized public chartering authority, in this case that would be TEA, to operate a charter school, and provided adequate and timely notice to that authority. So in this case, the Generation 26 application is that vehicle by which one would apply for the charter and provide timely and adequate notice to TEA that they are applying for the charter. And so in that regard, a Generation 26 charter applicant is more than likely going to be eligible to receive a grant award if ultimately authorized, but there are some exceptions. So one of the things that we will try to glean from our developers or charter holders, or pardon me, our sponsoring entities that are applying for a charter is whether or not that sponsoring entity is affiliated with a charter management organization. And this charter management organization we refer to as CMO is defined at the federal level again as a nonprofit organization that operates or manages a network of charter schools linked by a centralized support, operations, and oversight. So I think with a lot of the people with whom I spoke this week, most of them were completely, not affiliated with CMOs. They're individuals who are interested in just starting up a charter school. And so in that case, they're going to get the 501c3 established and they're going to apply for the charter, and they're not affiliated with nor proposing to contract with a charter management organization. But there may be instances where an applicant is affiliated with or proposing to contract with the CMO in their application. And that's where we need to dig a little bit deeper. So if the applicant is, pardon me, is affiliated with or proposing to contract with a management organization, the applicant will have to disclose whether or not the CMO currently receives or, let me try that again. If the applicant is affiliated with or proposing to contract with a management organization, the applicant will have to disclose if the management organization does not currently receive or will not receive CSP funds directly from the USDE. It will have to disclose if the CMO currently receives CSP funds directly from the USDE, or if the management organization will receive CSP funds directly from the USDE. That's actually on one of the addendums that we'll get into a little bit towards the end of the presentation. So when I mentioned, that little caveat that, more than likely if you apply for a charter through the Generation 26 application process and you're ultimately authorized, you're eligible to receive funds with this caveat. You can't receive a second grant if you're already affiliated with or proposing to contract with a management organization that's currently receiving CSP grant funds or will receive a CSP grant funds directly from the department. So we're prohibited, TEA is prohibited from awarding a grant to an entity that has already technically received a grant to open that school in the future. So that's the main thing that we're trying to glean here. But for most applicants, 501c3s, not CMOs, aren't affiliated with any CMOs and aren't proposing to contract with any CMOs. Otherwise, if you have questions and you are affiliated with the CMO, we can discuss those separately. Next slide, please. So we're going to get into now the allowable uses of funds, and that's always, a big question from our applicants about what kind of, funding is available and how those funds can be used. And first of all, I should probably point out that the maximum grant award for this particular round of funding that we received from the department, the maximum grant award is going to be $900,000 per authorized charter school. And keep in mind, I know that John Garland mentioned, we refer to charter school at the LEA level or at the district level, and then charter school campuses below that. So if you're proposing to open a charter with one campus, a single campus charter, you would be eligible for $900,000. If you're proposing to open, say within the span of your first 5 years, a charter school with 3 different campuses, you're still only eligible for $900,000 in terms of startup grant funds. So please keep that in mind. You don't get $900,000 per proposed campus. So in terms of allowable costs and allowable expenditures with these grant funds, the U.S. Department of Ed requires that we report on these grant funds and how they're encumbered and expended in terms of planning activities versus implementation activities. So that's why in the CSP addendum, you're going to have to create a budget for that $900,000, and you're going to have to budget in 2 columns. One's the planning column, one's the implementation column. And so it gets a little complicated, but for the most part, you will have access to these slides in the future, and you can go back to kind of look at, what planning activities what are considered to be planning activities as opposed to implementation activities. So planning activities are tied to the planning and design of the educational program, which may include 1, refinement of the desired educational results and of methods for measuring progress towards achieving those results, and 2, professional development of teachers and other staff who will work in the charter school. And I can tell you right now from experience with working for this, with this grant for several years, the bulk of the planning activities that we tend to see budgeted in any given year for charter school program startup grants are tied to professional development of teachers and other staff who will work in the charter school. So kind of keep that in mind. I mean, there are other types of planning activities, but the bulk of them that we see budgeted are for PD, professional development. Next slide, please. Then we get into implementation activities, and this is generally where we see most of the funds budgeted for new charter schools that receive the grant are tied to implementation activities. And those are activities that are tied with the initial implementation of a charter school, which may include informing the community about the school, acquiring necessary equipment and educational materials and supplies, and that's really the bulk of where we see our funds budgeted, acquiring or developing curriculum materials, and other initial operational costs that cannot be met from state or local resources. So again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, budgeted expenditures should be tied to the type of activity, regardless of when the expenditure occurs. It's got to either be a planning activity or an implementation activity that those funds are tied to. So again, we've talked about allowable costs for planning activities. Again, that middle bullet is professional development, training for teachers and staff. That's where we see the bulk of our expenditures for planning budgeted. But it can also be for planning and design of the charter school's educational program, or special ed support. We'll see in terms of special ed training or PD before school starts. They'll want to, a new charter school may want to get all the teachers that are hired up to date on special ed requirements or IDEA requirements, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So they'll bring somebody in to just train everybody involved at the school in what the federal requirements are, what the state requirements are. And that would be something that would be, a planning activity cost for the charter school. Again, we've spoken about implementation activities, but the bulk of what we see budgeted in, any given year for startup are one-time startup equipment purchases necessary to implement a charter school, which may include, but are not necessarily limited to, the following: desks, chairs, and computers, right? Super obvious stuff. We need desks, we need chairs, we need computers. We need, especially now more than ever, equipment related to technology, physical education, and art. And playground equipment. A lot of folks say, well, playground equipment doesn't seem like it should be allowable. It seems kind of, something that's not really tied to education. But, when you're dealing with elementary school age children, especially, that playground equipment is really important for the kids to get outside and play. And that's something that, as a one-time startup cost, you can certainly use these funds for. As far as implementation activities go, you can also use them for non-consumable supplies and materials for startup activities, including textbooks, library books, reading materials, and teaching materials. And just to kind of, getting a phone call here, just to talk about the library books, that's where we've kind of seen a lot of schools that are close to the end of their grant project period and they have some money left over. It's like, what can we use this money on? It's like, let's build up our library. Let's buy more library books and get that library built up. And so that's oftentimes where they'll kind of fill in some gaps. Keep in mind that these materials have to be non-consumable supplies. And I know I had something in my notes that I wanted to share with you. So it can't be, this does not include this. You can't use these funds for consumable materials like student workbooks. We also had a question. I had a question just the other day about karate uniforms for kids and pep squad uniforms. It's like, no, those are something that we would consider to be consumables. The kids are going to use up throughout the year and then either keep the uniforms or in other words, they're consumable. They're going to get used up, whereas they can't be used year after year. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So you can also use charter schools program funds for costs associated with the installation of the following: computers, data systems, networks, and telephone systems. And with regard to brand new startups, newly authorized startups by the commissioner that ultimately don't get vetoed by the State Board of Education, there's an expectation that those charter schools will purchase financial accounting software that will allow that new LEA, you know, Heather mentioned that county district number, that 6-digit number, that will allow for that new charter school to be able to meet the reporting requirements with regard to financials and PEMS. And all of those, you know, types of reporting systems you can use CSP funds to purchase those systems. In fact, we're going to ask you about it if you do get authorized, to make sure that you have budgeted for that and that you ultimately do make that purchase so that you can meet all the reporting requirements that TEA has. Next slide, please. So these particular allowable costs are actually new under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as amended by ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act. An applicant can use use CSP funds for one-time startup costs associated with providing transportation to students to and from the charter school campus. That used to be prohibited, but now it's allowed. Keep in mind that if you're looking at one-time startup costs, the majority of folks who are looking at that would be to purchase an actual school bus, and those are very, very expensive and can eat into that $900,000 grant very quickly. But also keep in mind that a lot of charter schools don't provide transportation to their students. They just kind of state that, at the beginning, up front, they're not going to provide transportation. But if a charter school chooses to provide transportation services, it is eligible for state funding associated with providing those services, much in the same way that a school district is. Allowable costs also include rental or occupancy costs for the school facility up to the first 30 days of what we call the initial implementation phase in preparation for opening of the charter school campus. So, we've got a planning phase and an implementation phase. The planning phase is pretty much once you get authorized as a charter and before you actually begin serving students. The implementation phase is basically the first day of school onward. You're implementing your program. Keep in mind that the phase isn't what you're going to budget. You're not going to budget money into those two columns based on when you spend the money. You're going to tie it back to that activity, whether it's a planning activity or an implementation activity. And those activities can occur in either phase of the charter. But again, rental occupancy costs up to the first 30 days of school are allowable. And so are costs associated with carrying out necessary renovations and minor facilities repairs, excluding construction, which is a no-no with pretty much almost every single federal grant, to ensure that the new school building complies with applicable statutes and regulations. So I do have that slide up, and I have some notes associated with that. So this is some guidance that we actually received from the Department of Ed on this particular item. It says, these types of budgeted expenditures may require some USDE approval, and they actually gave us some guidance. They said, example of minor facilities repairs may include repairing a leak in the roof, replacing a broken window, and replacing a furnace or air conditioning unit. In essence, minor facilities repairs neither add to the permanent value of the property nor appreciably prolong its intended life, but rather keep it in efficient operating condition. And they quote 2 CFR 200.452, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, section 200.452, I think is where they actually cited this. Okay, next slide, please. So again, we talked about that financial management software and training that you can use startup grants for, grant funds for, property insurance to cover all of the equipment purchased with the grant funds, and other appropriate non-sustained costs that cannot be supported from other sources. So you can also use CSP grant funds for payroll. The ESSA is pretty specific about which positions can be funded with CSP startup grant funds. So they specifically mention teachers, school leaders, and specialized instructional support personnel salaries, limited during the planning phase, again, you know, from when you get the grant until school opens, and up to the first 30 days of school, provided that those individuals are associated with planning activities or implementation activities as opposed to ongoing operations. And let me check my slide to check my notes here. Specialized instructional support personnel can be charter campus based or new charter management organization staff dedicated to providing instructional supports. So again, it's pretty focused on teachers, school leaders like your principal, your superintendent, specialized instructional support personnel salaries. And again, we've talked about planning activities. You know, those include those activities tied to the refinement of the desired educational results and the methods for measuring progress towards achieving those results. And of course, the professional development component of the teachers and other instructional support staff who will work in the charter school campus. And then we talked about initial implementation activities, you know, informing the community about the campus, acquiring necessary equipment and educational materials and supplies, acquiring or developing curriculum materials, and teacher and staff recruiting. So, you know, you can basically use these funds for payroll for those types of positions listed, so long as those individuals who are being paid from the grant are actually participating in those planning activities or initial or implementation activities, as opposed to ongoing operations. Next slide, please. So this talks about time and effort. If personnel who are going to be paid for, you know, all or in part with CSP funds, you know, during that planning period, and they're doing planning activities, they're doing implementation activities. Let's say you hire a principal pretty early on, and that principal is out recruiting, and he or she is out also working on curriculum and setting up those purchase vouchers to make those, you know, purchases of equipment, desks, chairs, computers, etc. If that principal is doing 100% planning and implementation activities, you can fund them 100% of their salary. As you get closer to the school year, it gets kind of tricky because now the principal is getting ready to do their principal duties, right? They're hiring staff, which is, you know, arguably you're recruiting, and that's an implementation activity also. But at some point, you know, school starts, and you can use the funding. You can use CSP funds to fund them into, you know, the first 30 days of school. But once they start actually doing their principal duties, like their ongoing activities that they were hired to do, that's when you're going to really start to need to prorate their salaries and say, okay, well, the principal is paid to work 8 hours a day to be the principal of the school, and they oversee school, you know, the daily school activities. But then after school's over, they're still going to go out to the apartment complexes close by and try to recruit more students to the school. You can prorate that salary to say, okay, well, some of their hours are actually spent on recruitment, or some of their hours are spent on professional development, and then the rest of their hours are actually doing what we hired them to do. That's when you're going to have to get into the time and effort part, because you've got to keep adequate, you know, time and effort reporting to make sure that you're just not funding them outright for the first 30 days of school, 100% of their salary for planning and implementation activities, when we know pretty much now they're actually doing their regular full-time job. I know that gets complicated, but just, keep double checking these slides and go back to them as needed. Next slide, please. Unallowable uses of funds. Let me see. We've got to probably run through these pretty quickly. Let's go to the next slide, John. Got about 5 minutes left. Field trips hosted, and these are general, guys, for pretty much a lot of the federal grants that are out there. So field trips, hosting of sponsoring conferences or advisory councils. Memberships, we really don't allow grant funds to be used. Salaries or contracted personnel beyond the first 30 days of the initial implementation phase of the charter school, which starts the day school begins serving students. Debt service or lease purchases. On the debt service side, I can tell you, or lease purchase side, I used the example last time about a copier. A charter school said, well, we want to enter into a lease agreement with Xerox and they're going to provide us the copiers or whatever. Can we use CSP funds? It's like, no, you can't get into a lease agreement, a lease purchase for the equipment, but you can purchase the copier outright with CSP funds, because that would be considered a one-time startup cost. So keep that in mind as you work through the budget. Field trip, next slide. That was a lease purchase. Rental or occupancy costs for the school facility beyond the first 30 days. 30 days beyond the first day of school, you got to stop paying those rental or occupancy costs. Purchase or lease of land or real estate. Construction, again, a no-no with most federal grants. Consumable, instructional, or other supplies and materials, and we talked about that, just consumable items aren't allowed. Accounting, bookkeeping services, except for the purchase of that accounting software to comply with the financial accounting reporting. We kind of talked about that already. Next slide, please. Annual audit services, those are required in state law, so you can't use the federal funds for something that would be required in state law. That's supplanting. Ongoing food services, other property and liability insurance, interest on loans, deposits, religious instruction. And I know Heather went over this and I can't stress it enough. We get monitored on this grant every so often. And I cannot tell you how disappointed I am when our USDE monitors actually go out to grant recipients and discover religious iconography. Of course, I don't think there's ever been an instance where CSP funds were used to purchase the iconography, but Heather mentioned, you've got to be non-sectarian in your operations. You can't have those crosses or stars of David or any religion, religious iconography available. And certainly you can't use CSP funds for that. And then extracurricular activities such as UIL competitions, athletic programs that are not part of the state required PE program, again, just unallowable costs. So let's get into the addendum very quickly. There's a couple of sections. The first part is the qualified opportunity zones. We'll get into that in just a moment. The narrative section, education plan, roles and responsibilities, parent and community engagement, transportation, student outcome goals, and grant related budgets. All of those are required in the actual federal statute under Title 4 Part C. And then there are two attachments. There are two addenda, the equitable access to participation piece, and then the CMO receipt of funds. We kind of went over that at the beginning too. So next slide, please. So the QOZs, qualified opportunity zones, in our application to the Department of Ed, we did state that we would award priority points to any eligible applicant who wishes to serve students in a qualified opportunity zone, a school within a qualified opportunity zone. So if you are proposing to open a charter school in one of those QOZs, the application scoring process will allow for the award of some sort of a priority point for applicants committed to serving students who would otherwise attend a school located in a QOZ. If awarded a charter, applicants committed to opening their respective schools in a QOZ will be required to provide specific census tract numbers and other information on how they plan to serve students in these high need areas. And you remember at the beginning, we talked about the purpose of the charter school program. It's to serve, students, but especially those who are traditionally underserved. I mean, that should be the main focus. And so that's kind of why we have this priority in there. So the narratives, each of these items must be answered, and I'm at my time, must be answered pursuant to 4303 F1C of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then these are the two attachments. One of them is the equitable access and participation piece that allows for applicants to indicate whether any barriers are foreseeable to equitable access and participation for any group that will receive services funded from this federal grant. And then we talked about the CMO, the Charter Management Organization receipt of funds. Is the sponsoring entity, is the 501c3 more than likely, a CMO or working with the CMO that is currently receiving or will receive a CSP grant. I think pretty much the CSP portion is pretty straightforward. You just need to answer those, federally required questions. And then again, there's a link to the QOZ piece directly in the application that will allow you to see all the qualified opportunity zones in Texas. And, it may be that you're already planning to open in an area that is in a QOZ, but it also may not be. And again, don't focus too much on that. If you're not, you're not. I mean, but if you are, please make note that we, that's something that we would really, really like to support. And again, we will have some sort of priority points tied to that QOZ piece.
Arnold.
Yes.
We have a few questions for you. If you don't mind, we'll handle right now. First of all, would you review that they are applying for the CSP grant concurrently with the Gen 26 application? And then also, would you go over the competitive nature of the CSP grant? Because one of the questions is, can you be awarded a charter and not the CSP grant?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that's new this year. So the Generation 25 charters that were just authorized in September by the commissioner and not vetoed by the board. So we had 5 new charters that were authorized under Gen 25. They're actually going to have to complete a separate competitive CSP startup grant. And so there is a chance that theoretically one of those, one or more of those 5 charter schools can apply for the grant, not score high enough for funding, and not receive startup grant funds. I mean, that is totally within the realm of possibility. What we proposed to the department specifically this, with the Gen 26 application cycle, was to incorporate the requirements of the startup grant directly into the application for charter under Gen 26, because we know internally how rigorous of an application process this is, and how, it's vetted by, as Natalie mentioned, expert reviewers who are going to review and score these applications. They're going to provide a lot of input on what they do review, on the applications they do review. And, ultimately we have set a really high bar to fund, to authorize charters at that 85% threshold. And so what we basically propose to the department is, let us incorporate the grant application directly into the charter, the application for charter, such that if an entity is ultimately authorized by the commissioner, not vetoed by the board, they will have access to those funds, in a more timely fashion without having to do another competitive grant application after having just gone through such a rigorous one. Again, we can't guarantee that an entity that's authorized is going to automatically receive the grant. We have that component tied to the CMO. Again, if somebody's working with the CMO or there's an out-of-state operator who's, on the webinar today, if they are we're going to need to determine whether or not that CMO is already receiving grant funds for the purposes of expanding into Texas, for example. before we're able to award them a grant. We'll have to make that call. We just want for the applicant to let us know up front whether or not, if they're completely unaffiliated with the CMO or whether they are affiliated with the CMO. And then that, that will require, again, a little, digging a little bit deeper. Did that answer the question, Drew?
I think so, yes.
Hey,
Thank you,
Arnold, this is John. Can I just add one piece to that? Sorry, I think
Sure.
maybe the potential applicant was also asking. So translating that mathematically, the CSP scoring is embedded within the total possible points for each application. So we're not mathematically determining CSP criteria separately from the rest of the application. It's all one long total possible score. So if you get 85%, presumably then you would be eligible, barring what Arnold said, to be considered for the CSP grant as well.
I mean, and they'd have to go through the capacity interview. So it's not just that 85%, it's 85% gets you to the capacity interview. And then it's like, then you get, the capacity interview. And then at that point, the commissioner or its designees, will make their decisions based on how those interviews go. But, it really, really is a rigorous process. I told more than one person this week with whom I spoke, and I know a couple of you are on this webinar. It's like, man, if opening a charter school were easy, I would have done it already. It's really, really hard. And so, we made the petition, in our application to the Department of Ed that, beyond Gen 25, so Gen 26 and, and beyond, our plan is to incorporate the components of the CSP grant application directly into the application for charter. And hopefully we're able to do that.
Thank you, Arnold. I have one other short question and then some others to address during the 30-minute Q&A. One of the questions is, would startup costs associated with science CTE or math labs be considered allowable expenses?
Yeah, as a science and math guy myself, absolutely. Lab equipment for, again, lab equipment for the classroom is non-consumable in most cases. You're going to be able to use that equipment from year to year to year, beakers and Bunsen burners and all of that, science. Yeah, tons of fun stuff, man. So yeah, you can totally use it. If it's consumable, then no. If it's a consumable item, the consumable item that, I don't think I referenced earlier, but would be like a student workbook, like where you give the kids like a writing handbook and they get to trace it out on the different pages and turn in their assignments. They pull it out of the book and they turn it in. That's consumable. That's something that, at the end of the year can't be reused. So you couldn't make those purchases with CSP grants because they're consumable. But yeah, science equipment, that's a great use of these funds.
Thank you, Arnold. That's all for now. We'll have some more questions for you during the 30-minute Q&A period at the end of our presentations.
Assuming my internet connection holds up, I will be there.
If I stop sharing my screen, we should probably be looking a little bit like Brady Bunch mode right now. Natalie is going to run our first Are You There poll while Peja gets ready to present. That first poll says, where are you interested in opening a charter school? And of course, you're going to pick the nearest city. We're going to give you a few seconds because there's a lot of people in the room, so we're going to let those response numbers climb for a second. All right, I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. We're getting there. All right, if we can get 100 respondents, I'll be happy. We're at 80. Who hasn't responded? There we go. Keep it climbing. We're at 85. Come on. Got 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3. Oh, we're almost there. 2, 1. All right, we're going to end the poll. All right, thank you all so much. Peja, are you ready? I believe you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. You ready?
Yes, I am.
Take it away.
Hi, okay. My name is Pija, and I am with the Financial Compliance Division. And today I'm here to talk to you about the financial plan and the financial workbook, which are parts of the application that you have to submit to us. So I'm going to share my screen. And part of my presentation is going to be on the plan, and then I will navigate through the financial workbook so that you can get an idea of how to enter the data in the workbook. So, oops. The financial plan, you are asked to provide a detailed narrative startup plan. And the startup plan that you describe in this section should align with the startup budget in the financial plan workbook, meaning that whatever information you enter in your startup plan should match or should align with the budgeted items in the financial plan workbook. And it should outline costs associated with all your startup activities, specify tasks, timelines, and individuals responsible for each task. And you should include a contingency plan just in case your anticipated funding does not come through or is lower than what you expected. So you should specify contingency that you can fall back on. And you need to describe how the board will monitor the implementation of the startup plan, and provide a description of the systems and policies that you will be using for financial planning, accounting, purchasing, and payroll. And then describe and lay out the roles and responsibilities of the school administration and the governing board for the school finances. And give us a list of your contracted services such as food, transport, auditing, legal, and other contracted services. And then state the criteria that you will be using to select the contractors and what qualifications you will be looking for in vendors. Then please provide the most recent financial audit report, recent credit reports, and IRS forms. And if you do not have this documentation, give us a brief explanation about that. And then describe how you will be ensuring financial transparency both to the TEA and to the public, especially about the public adoption of the budget. And give us a list of the insurance coverages that the schools will carry, such as the workers' comp, property, indemnity, insurance for the directors and officers. And most important, please give us letters of commitments from your committed donors and the anticipated donations. And then give us the donations that have already been collected and the documentation to show that this money has been received. And your fundraising and outreach efforts can be listed in the plan. Okay, now I'm going to try to share the financial workbook. Okay, John, can you see the workbook?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. So now this is the financial workbook, and the most current version of this workbook is updated in your application. At the bottom of the workbook, you can see 4 green color tabs. These are tabs that you use to enter all your information. And then you see the blue color tabs. These are informational, and you do not enter any information in these tabs. The information that you enter in the green tabs populate the information in the blue tabs. And then, of course, you have to enter information only in the white color cells.
Hey,
The
Pija.
others are, Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you hit that enable editing button? I think that might open the screen so we can see the tabs. We're having a hard time seeing. See if that works.
Yeah, hold on. It's going round and round. Okay. Is that better?
Is there a way you can move your screen up a little bit? I think we're just having a little bit of a hard time seeing that. Or you know what?
Uh-oh. Hold on just. Can you see it?
I think our panelists might be able to see it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So where was I? Okay. So yes, like I said, the information that you enter in the green tabs automatically populate the blue tabs down here. And some cells are formula driven, so you won't be able to enter information. So all your data is entered in the white color tabs. And then some tabs, you will find a little red triangle on the upper right corner. And if you hover over that, it brings you up the guidance that you can follow for information to be entered in that particular field. Our very first tab here is the school info tab. This is the first tab, and it asks for basic information such as the applicant's name, email, phone, the fiscal year end for the startup year, the fiscal year end for year one, and the fiscal year end date, and the total school minutes. So just to show you, for the applicant name, I'm just going to enter my name. And for the startup year end, I'm going to enter 2021. And the fiscal year end is you guys? Yeah? Uh-oh, I'm sorry. Let me share screen again. I don't know what happened. It just went
No
blank.
problem.
Okay. Hold on. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry about that. I guess my internet went down. I don't know. So the applicant name, again, I put my name, and we were right here. The year one financial fiscal year end is 2022. Then for the year end date, you can click on this tab and you can see a drop down selection here, and you can have a year end date of June 30th or August 31st. And I'm going to go with June 30th. And the total school minutes, as you can see, the guidance comes up. I'm going to enter 75,600 minutes. So that is our school info tab, and the information that you enter in this tab populates all the fields throughout the workbook. Then we can go to our enrollment tab. Now the enrollment tab, you can enter the estimated number of students by each grade and by the year. And as you can see, the years populated from the information that we entered in the school info tab. So, and then down here, you see the average daily attendance percentage. This is an important field that has to be entered because this determines how much school aid that your school will receive, and it populates that in the startup and year one assumptions tab. And then going down, you can complete the information here for the different categories of student population, such as the special ed, career technology, dyslexia, pregnancy-related, bilingual. And then you come down here to the transportation part. The transportation section can be completed with the number of students, estimated students for each specific program. So going up here. So for year one, for kindergarten, I'm going to have an estimate of 50 students. And then for year 2, I'm going to go up to maybe 60 and then 80 for year 3. And in this way, you can complete all the years by the different grades. And then coming down here to the average daily attendance percentage, I'm going to use a conservative estimate of 85%. And in this way, you can enter all your information for the different student populations by grade and by the year in this tab. One thing to note in this tab is, like Heather had mentioned earlier, it is really best that you enter conservative and realistic estimates for the enrollment, because overestimating enrollments leads to over budgeting expected revenues, and that is like a frequent cause for financial distress going forward. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. And we move to our personnel tab. The personnel tab, you enter information about the staff that you're going to be having for the operations, school operations. And you have a column here for the position description and the position category, the starting salary of each position, and the number of FTEs starting from the startup year to year 5. Then in column M, you can put down your notes to tell us anything about these positions that you're going to be hiring, including the CSP grant funding that's attributed to each position. And then here on the right, these columns N through S, are populated based on the information that we enter on the right side here. So just to give you an example, the first position that I'm going to put down here is business manager. And then I'm going to go over to this field here, the position category, and you have a drop-down selection menu of different options that you can choose from for that particular position. And here I see operations business manager. And for the starting salary, I'm going to put 70,000. Again, these are just, I'm just showing you examples. And for the startup year, I'm going to say that we need 1 FTE as for the position of the business manager, and the same for year 1, and year 2, and year 3, and you can complete that for all the years. Then going down, administration staff, which is admin, and then I will choose from the menu here to go down and choose administrative staff. And for the starting salary, I'm going to say 50,000. And for the startup year, I'm going to have one person for admin staff, 1 FTE. And then for year 2, I might go up to 2 positions for that, and same for year 3. And then most important, teachers. And then choose from our menu. And if you click this, you will see that for teachers, we have different categories for like regular teachers, special ed, substitute, assistant. So we're just going to have regular teachers here. And starting salary of 55,000 maybe. And for the startup year, I'm not going to have any teachers. For year 1, I'm going to say that we're going to have 4 teachers. Again, these are just examples. And for year 2, say we go up to 7 teachers, and year 3, 8 teachers. And then I'm going to choose a non-instructional position here, like maybe say nurse, school nurse. And here you come down and go down to see, find the category of nurse right here. The starting salary, say 55,000. And startup year, we're not going to have a nurse. And for year one, we can have, we'll have one nurse, and that'll be the same for the rest of the years. And in the same way, you can go down and enter all the staff that you're going to be hiring, and the position category and their salaries and the number of FTEs that you're going to have from startup year to year 5. Then if you come down, if you go down to this part of your part of this spreadsheet here, you can see that it populated based on all the information that we entered here. Like, for example, we had one business manager, and that's what's showing up here. And just going down to teachers, you can see that for year one, we had 4 teachers at the starting salary of 55,000, and that gets calculated, and that shows here, and it changes with the number of teachers for each year. And then on this side of the screen, here you can enter your yearly raise that you are anticipating, and for each position. So I'm going to have a 2% raise for each position here. And when I put that 2% raise, the field here, it gets automatically calculated and populated here. So you don't have to calculate anything. It does it for you. So in this way, you go ahead and you complete this, this tab with all the information on the staff that you are going to be hiring for the school. And then we go to our startup year one and assumptions tab. Now here you enter the budgeted amounts for the proposed charter for the startup year and for year one. This is startup year, year one. Then the anticipated percentage of increases and decreases can be entered in columns H through M here. Then again, you enter a detailed description or detailed notes on the assumptions, and also on the CSP grants, notes on the CSP grants that is attributed to each position and category. So here you can see the total state revenue has been populated based on the information on the ADA percentage that we entered in the enrollment tab. Then we come here to the charter CSP grant, and we enter the amount here, 90,000. And then going down, you can see that for the personnel costs, you can see that these fields have been populated based on the information that we entered in the personnel tab. For example, the manager salary of 70,000, the admin staff, as you can see, we had one admin staff for the startup year, and then we had 2 for year one. And similarly for the teachers, you can see the salaries have been populated here, and the school nurse that we entered. And again, I just entered a few positions just to show you how the information carries over. But when you enter all the staff that you intend to hire, then all these positions will, all these tabs will be populated. Then going down, you can see the category of payroll taxes that you can enter here, and there are various selections. And if you don't find something here that matches what you want to enter, you can always enter that description here and the amount that goes with it. Then you have contracted services such as accounting, legal, management company fee, and then school operations, like classroom supplies, materials, textbooks, and so on. And then you go down to the faculty, like your property management, building leases, repairs, and then reserves. It's very advisable that you budget for reserves and contingencies. And then we have the totals here. So that is all the information that you enter in the startup year one and assumptions tab. And then we go to our budget tab. And here you can see information has been updated from the previous tabs, and you do not enter any information in the budget tab, and the same with the financial plan workbook summary. This gets completed based on all the information that you have already input in the 4 green tabs. And this gives you an overview of your finances, of your budget from the startup year to year 5. And then we go to the summary of finances. The summary of finances tab shows an estimate of the total school aid. And this has been updated and shows the most current information. And no data is entered in this tab. On a final note, I just want to say that we review all the items that you send us. We review the item, we review your information, the financial plan, and then each line item that you provide in the budget. So the notes and the comments and explanations that you give us will reduce questions and will make it easier for us in our review. And then I really want to suggest that you get familiar with the workbook and just see how the data moves from one screen to the other screen, how it carries over. And so before you input any of your actual numbers, just take some time to navigate through the workbook and get comfortable. That'll make it easier for you. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Here you go, John.
Thank you, PJ. Good. Heather, did you want to go ahead and lead us out?
Yes, thank you, Peter. When you were going over that, applicants, just know that we look at that information very closely and compare what is in the narrative and what is listed in your financial workbook, looking for alignment of those things. So we have some additional things that we are going to be covering. One, we have a poll that we will be administering, and so please don't leave to go to the restroom or leave early, because we are looking at the results of those polls to make sure that everyone has stayed engaged and has stayed with us through this long haul this morning. I know we've given you a lot of information in a virtual setting. Brain research says that attention span of adults is about 20 minutes. So congratulations, everyone, for going above and beyond that. Anyway, so we have a poll, and then we have a Q&A, and there were several questions, I think, that we're going to try and address in the supplemental Q&A. But I just wanted to say to all of you, we find ourselves in some very unique times, and we know that that is going to no doubt color some of what you propose, but ultimately going back to that slide of why we all have entered the field of education, and that's to make a difference in the lives of students. And we hope that today's presentation has given you the tools that you need to demonstrate to us those innovative plans that you're going to be submitting. And with that said, I know we're at 11:23, and John, you have a poll for folks?
Yeah, Natalie, if you want to run that poll for us. Oh, there it is. So our poll number 2 is, what topic area are you the most uncertain about? And I also just want to reiterate something that Heather said. We are monitoring these responses to make sure that you're engaged.
Hence that desire of John's to see 100%.
That would be ideal, yeah. There's 120 attendees, it says, so if we can get up to close to that, that will let me know that you all are still there. So I'm going to give it 15 more seconds.
And while you're waiting, and I'm trying to buy them some more time, I just want to remind y'all of the need to complete the survey. I think that will be coming to you. We'll be addressing some additional questions that were in the Q&A function, and that ultimately we are going to be posting all of those Q&As in the FAQ that will be posted on our webpage. Did I buy them more time, John?
You bought
Where
them
are we?
so much more time. Okay, let's end that poll. Thank you.
All right. Well, on behalf of TEA, I do appreciate your engagement. I know that we encounter technological difficulties with just expertise. I'm speaking for myself, expertise in using technology, but also bandwidth is a new thing for all of us. We look forward to reading your applications. Each of us on that you're looking at right now will be reading those applications in their entirety. I do want to say sometimes less is more. We have read applications that are 500 pages long, and we have read applications that are 1,200 pages long. And the difference in length does not always reflect the difference in quality. So be well, everyone. I hope you stay with us for the Q&A, but if you are unable, please know that those questions and answers will also be addressed in the FAQ.
Yep. So before we transition, everyone, thank you again for attending. How this is going to roll out. So next steps. If you are still with us, you do not have to stay for the Q&A. Your attendance requirement has been met. As Heather said earlier, we will provide that confirmation to you later next week. If you do stay on, again, we're going to spend about 30 minutes answering questions. We will post this webinar along with last week's Q&A, so they will be recorded. If you, for whatever reason, don't stay, you can still review what we talk about here in the next few minutes. With that said, thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and call this webinar, and we will now transition into the 30-minute Q&A. Drew?
All right, Heather, we have a few questions for you, and we have a couple for John, Peja, and Arnold as well. To begin with, Heather, could you please go over the definition of high quality? And then I have a follow-up question for you.
So in the chat or Q&A function, I wasn't sure if the question was focused on my presentation where I was referencing high quality, or if we were talking about experienced operators as are referenced in the education code. And so when we talk about high quality, we have some goals for our portfolio that our operators are of a high quality, meaning an A or B rating overall. Obviously, new operators will not have that rating to reflect. Experienced operators, however, in the education code in 12.10.11, there is a definition for experienced operators, and we have a second application for experienced operators. And in that application, they can demonstrate their accountability ratings. Accountability ratings across states don't translate so fluidly. There are, none of us are psychometricians, even Peja, but she comes closest. But all joking aside, the experienced operator application does allow an applicant to provide their most recent ratings and a comparable performance rating to the Texas 5-tier ratings. There was a question about, are we talking about a 1 year or 3 year? We do look at the most recent year, and we also, Commissioner Rule has not been promulgated because we've addressed that primarily in the experienced operator application. But when I saw that question, I was like, well, maybe it's time. The reason we haven't had rules around that is in Texas, we have had a binary Met standard improvement required until most, well, fairly recently, last 3 years. We've really gone to a 5-tier or A through F system. And the applicants that we have had from out of state or from another authorizer have been somewhat limited until just most recently last year. So I hope all of that addressed the very nuanced parts of that question.
Yes, thank you. That was the follow-up. Heather, we have another question for you. Could you go over the board member qualifications as far as how it pertains to family members and also family members who might be employed at the charter school?
And yes, certainly. I tried to put the list in the chat. I don't know if everyone saw that, and it'll also be in our FAQ. But essentially, those relationships are outlined as a third degree of consanguinity or affinity. And so if you're a board member, you should not be sitting on the board with another family member. You should be, and I always mess these up, but a spouse, a child, a parent, grandparent, great-grandparent. I'm looking for what I put in the chat. Grandchild, great-grandchild, sibling, aunt, uncle, niece, nephew. So you should not be looking at anybody if you're sitting on the board and calling any of the people on that board honey for any reason, because they're your spouse or your child, your parent, your grandparent, great-grandparent. I guess that's the easiest way to describe it. Karen Johnson had a much more fluid description of that. Did that address it, Drew? What was the second part of the question?
The second part was board members related to charter school employees.
So that's good. A public officer cannot hire or appoint individuals, and as a member of a governing board, you're a public officer, a public official. And so if you are on the board, you should not be, there shouldn't be folks that you are hiring, appointing. There are instances where, like my sister and I are both teachers. We can be employees of the charter school, but we should not be reporting to my husband, who is the superintendent of the charter school. And so there are some caveats, and it's tied to the direct reporting structure. So you've got, I guess, two things to think about: your board relationship and that board relationship with the superintendent, and then superintendent relationship and employees of the charter school. We should not be reporting to one another, essentially, is what that, I should not be reporting to anyone I'm related to within a third degree of consanguinity or affinity.
Thank you. Heather, I have another question for you. If you are potentially opening as a performing arts school and also a STEM school, how do you go about having students enroll? Because performing arts can have the, I forgot the word, audition. So how would that work, or can it be possible?
Well, we like to say, we don't like to say it can't be possible. That, we've never had that before, where an entity has proposed to be a performing arts school as well as a STEM school. There's a provision in statute specifically for performing arts schools, 121171, that essentially allows you not at the admission phase, but at the enrollment phase to incorporate an audition into your enrollment policy. If you are the single entity, I think you are going to have to, no doubt, submit a detailed description of what you're proposing, because essentially what you're proposing is the same admission pathway, and then a pathway that breaks off and would allow for you, as referenced under the statute 121171, to have a performing arts aspect. And then the STEM aspect is open enrollment. Those students could not be for any reason excluded if you had room. This is something that we've never done before, and would want to really encourage you to think strongly around any kind of any remote possibility of what we reference as a chilling effect. And what came to mind as I was talking, if you have an instant where a child is wanting to, if your educational design is two concurrent educational designs, the performing arts and the STEM being offered concurrently, one that's going to be very pricey in terms of the finances supporting those two separate things. But two, making sure that if a STEM student is applying, there's no chilling effect, a real or perceived, because of the enrollment policy. So
Thank you.
just be real descriptive. And if you are awarded, we're going to be working with you extensively on what that would look like.
I have a couple more questions going back to the board. To be clear, a family member can be employed, but just can't report to a board member who is a family member?
So a board member's relative within the third degree of consanguinity or affinity cannot be employed by the charter school. I have my husband who is superintendent, and I am a cafeteria worker, or if I'm not directly reporting to him. So even if what makes it difficult, y'all, is in the first years of operation, you are, as I believe on the reference, a standalone charter. Your charter is a single campus. We've rarely had anybody who's opened multiple campuses. And so in your structure, oftentimes we see the first year of operations, the superintendent is also the principal. And so you could not report to somebody who is related to you in any kind of reporting structure as an employee of the school. So whether that is superintendent / principal, if I were the teacher and my husband was superintendent / principal, I could not report to him. And so that would be a prohibition.
Thank you. A couple more board questions.
And, you know, I know this whole thing about consanguinity and affinity and these relationships are, it's kind of dicey territory. So please consult with your attorneys. Your general counsel should be able to kind of help you understand that landscape a little bit better. So.
If I am the only board member representing the board for the sake of this meeting and this application cycle, can I later step down from the board and be hired in a founding role of the school?
We often see applicants who are on the founding board who then, if the charter is awarded, will step down from the board and will take on the role of superintendent or even principal will take on a role with the school. So I think the big thing there is that, you know, as a board member and the sole board member who's represented in this meeting, you are not removed from the application in any way. You are still represented in the application, and we would expect if you make it to both a capacity interview and then proposal that you would be represented in that regard as well.
Thank you. There's another similar question regarding board governance. Our 501c3's executive director is currently a board member of our arts nonprofit, and if awarded a charter, will step down from the board to serve as the superintendent. Will a signed board statement to that effect be sufficient in the application process?
I'm thinking this is the performing arts entity again.
I'm thinking, but sure.
It sounds like there are two nonprofits possibly. Repeat that question again.
Oh, goodness.
I'm sorry, I'm looking for them on the chat, but there's
It's
a
in the
lot.
Q&A and I just dismissed it. Let's see if I can
Okay.
find it.
Okay, well, suffice to say, I think what I heard is there's two nonprofit entities. One is a performing arts entity and one is the entity that's applying for the charter. And the piece that I lost was the person that is on the performing arts, not 501c3, would then become,
I found it.
okay.
We will also address this in the FAQ just so that everybody knows. Regarding board governance, our 501c3's executive director is currently a board member of our arts nonprofit. And if awarded a charter, will step down from the board to serve as the superintendent. Will a signed board statement to that effect be sufficient in the application process? I think it's similar to your last question.
I think it is too. The thing that threw me was the arts nonprofit. And if there is a relationship with that arts nonprofit, there might be additional considerations. Again, your general counsel can help you understand those relationships. But yes, at a very high level, that should suffice.
Okay, a couple more questions. Could you talk about the no contact rule, please?
Both in the state board rule and the commissioner rule, there is a provision for no contact once the application is submitted. So in January, when your application is submitted, you are prohibited from contacting the TEA, contacting SBOE, and the reason for this is to, in essence, prevent any kind of lobbying for your charter school within the time that those entities, TEA and SBOE, are discerning as to whether or not to approve your charter. In the recent past and in the very distant past, the reason for this rule, many years ago, we had an applicant who reached out to a board member's wife's boss to talk to them about the charter school. And the wife felt as if her job was in jeopardy. So just, we recognize that, you know, no one in recent years would engage in any activities that would appear to be strong arming, lobbying, or in any way veiled threats. But in order to protect you and to be very clear, we've got that in both SBOE and commissioner rules. So starting in January, once you submit your application, you should not make any communications, you or a representative of your applicant team or your 501c3 team, your governing board team. The provision does not prevent you from responding to questions that SBOE members may have or that TEA may have of you, but you cannot initiate that.
Thank you. I have one more question for Heather, and then we'll move on to John with a few questions. Are charters required to follow any state procurement processes, example, competitive bidding? Do charters have access to state procurement contracts, examples, Texas Smart Buy?
So procurement is, there are some provisions in Chapter 12 for around procurement. And then also, and I'm looking for it right now because this is not my area of expertise, but it is outlined in Chapter 12 about what you are going to follow in terms of that procurement. So Drew, let me find that and then I'll come back because I don't want to misspeak. And obviously we will also address that in the FAQ. And while I was talking, so 12-1053 is applicability of laws relating to public purchasing and contracting, and it highlights those provisions in the government code. And then also charter schools can elect to have some provisions if they so deem to be followed, Chapter 44 provisions.
Okay, I had a question about the number of questions and that participants cannot see the questions or the answers. We will be posting these in the FAQ, so don't worry about that. John, there was a question about whether they can submit the advertisement for the public meeting in an online newspaper such as Austin American Statesman, or must it be the print version?
It must be the print version to meet the requirement for the application. So again, if you want to go above and beyond that, that is completely up to the applicant. But to meet the application requirement, it will need to go in the print version.
And then could you address how any publicizing the meetings on social media might happen and that does not meet the requirement?
Good question. So I'll come back to it again. As long as you put the in-print version and meet the application requirement, you can go above and beyond. So if you meet that requirement and do a Facebook post or any other social media post, that's great. If you only do the social media post, you would not meet the requirement for the application.
Thank you. I have a question about the rubric. What does the point awarding rubric look like? Considering best or most successful attributes of past awarded charter applications, where should new applicants pay special attention along the way in the process in order to score best in the grading?
Another great question. If we were in person, I would go on this big long soapbox conversation about, I want applicants not to necessarily do these like scoring scenarios to see what the ideal response would be to meet the grade, right? I want applicants to put forth their best and most sincere proposal. And in theory, if you meet all the criteria, then again, in theory, you should make the 85%. That being said, I think applicants by and by across the years typically score the lowest on the finance section. And as Heather mentioned, really addressing needs for the special populations. I think those two places typically are the harder, I think, concepts to grasp for applicants. So as you all move forward and review those PowerPoints, the special education and English learner PowerPoints and presentations will be online later this afternoon. I would really spend some time with that. And then obviously Peach did an exceptional job with the financial piece. However, her PowerPoint will also be required material online, and it is a little bit more robust than what she went over today. And that also should give you a pretty good understanding of just what your financial expectations would be for the application.
Could you reiterate the modules, the mandated modules, as that was another question?
Yeah, absolutely. So today you saw 3 to 4 presentations. Online, you will have to review and complete selected legal topics, special education, e-English learners, financial accountability, and I believe state accountability. There are 5 or 6 additional modules. When you reach the end of those PowerPoints, there will be a link for you to download that certificate of completion or certificate of review. That's what you submit with your application. So they're required review. And those will be, as we looked and walked through the website, they're under the application information session tab.
Thank you. I have one last question for you and then another for Heather and 2 for Arnold and 2 for Peja. John, is it a problem if the board is not yet a legal entity at this moment, i.e. 501c3, or if we change our name from what was submitted for this meeting when we do finalize our legal status?
I think it's a multi-tiered question. I think the first part of that question was, to be a sponsoring entity, there's like 2 parts to that. You will have to file with the state. Once you're recognized by the state, then you will file for tax exempt status, that 501c3 status with the federal government. To apply by January 20th, you need to show proof of 2 things. Number 1, you need to show proof that you filed with the state, and you need to show proof that you've attempted to file for that tax exempt status with the IRS. What's not due on January 20th is proof that you are actually 501(c)(3) tax exempt. That, I believe, is due by April 8th. So just to repeat, on January 20th, what you're going to give me, or give us rather, is going to be proof that you file with the state. That's at Articles of Incorporation. And then proof that you've submitted to be considered for that tax exempt status.
I'm just going to jump in, though, because we did run into a problem a couple of years ago when the government shut down. So entities that had not secured their 501c3 status from the IRS, we ran into some hurdles, actually reached out to congressmen who represented the state of Texas, Congressman Cornyn, to help facilitate that. I just offer this because there's so much unknown in our current landscape. I don't want that to be something that you overlook. So please make sure that those things at least are filed and you are well on your way of taking care of that.
Drew, before you, I just want to piggyback on what Heather said. Another thing that applicants tend to do, some applicants take a very old nonprofit that's been on the books for a very long time. They started it, they just never did anything with it. It's there. They have the idea, we'll use that. I highly encourage you to just check to make sure your status is still current, because otherwise that's going to be a huge problem later on. So before you apply, make sure that that sponsoring entity is still active in both the state and the federal level.
Okay, thank you. Heather, question for you. Can we use a building owned by a board member?
You may use a building owned by a board member. We have had that occur. The arm's length transaction is something that, so it would fall under the umbrella of a related party transaction. We have had it occur where it is a highly reduced rate. And we have also had it occur when it was in excess of fair market value, the latter being an issue. So just the fact that a board member is providing a facility for consideration for renting or leasing, that would be something that would have to be reported in the related party transaction provisions. It's not prohibited, but we do look at it very closely to ensure that it is not in excess of fair market value.
Thank you. John, I'm going back to you real quickly. We have a question about who in particular has to complete the modules for the proposed charter. Each registered attendee, or in this case, the board member attending.
So what you all will submit in the application is just a certificate that it was reviewed. That can include someone on the application team. It just can't be some random person. So at this point, when you download it, it will say who the sponsoring entity is and the date completed. So someone on the application team or someone on the board needs to complete.
And this is important. I mean, this is a deviation from what we've done in the past. In the past, it was a board member. It was an all-day info session. That board member would be exposed to not only the presentations that were shared today, but also the presentations in the modules. So the only thing I caution you on is to make sure that whomever is watching those modules, should you be proposed by the Commissioner of Education, we would be expecting those same folks to still be on the board.
Thank you. All right, Pija, here's a question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference of the startup year versus the first year? And I think you're muted.
And that might also be a question for Arnold too,
Yes.
depending on.
Okay, so the startup year is basically where you you list all the expenses in the financial workbook that relate to that year. Like, for example, you may have more expenses related to your facilities, like finding a facility and legal services to make sure you go through the contracts, and that's what we've seen in previous applications. And so you won't be having like expenses for your personnel in the startup year because you won't be hiring teachers and so forth. So you'll see more of that in year one, and contracted services you'll also see more of that in year one. So just basically you include items that you are going to see in the startup year, where expenses that you're going to incur in that year is what you budget, what you show in the budget in the startup year. And in the financial plan, you give a narrative of all those expenses, and make sure that you just give a brief one-liner if that's what it takes, to make sure that you say we're spending $1,600 for auditing, and you show that expense in the financial plan. And the same for the first year, like your teachers, your personnel tab should show all the teachers that you're going to be hiring, all the other staff that you're going to be hiring, and it should also be laid out in the financial plan.
I think, yeah, that does help with the financial workbook. In general, the year zero or planning year is something that we often reference, and with the CSP grant is also referenced. Arnold, if you wanted to provide any planning year context.
Right. So I mean, we historically have referred to, year zero as the planning year to coincide with the federal statute that talks about a limitation on planning of not to exceed more than 18 months for planning, and then there's no restriction on implementation. But yeah, essentially that year zero is what we would consider from the time of authorization until the first day of school, right? So you're preparing to open the school, you're planning to open the school, you're expending CSP funds accordingly, both for planning and implementation activities during that time period. And then your year one is, your first year of actually serving students is kind of what it boils down to. So.
And that's important to understand the supplement, not supplant provision. It's a federal provision that says if it's required in state law and if it's funded, certainly, then you cannot spend federal funds on this. So in the state law, and I offer this because it was something that a previous applicant about 4 years ago just did not understand. When you are in your planning year or your year zero, you can use those federal CSP funds if you are awarded them for personnel. Once school starts, there are requirements to teach, there are requirements to run your school. So unless you're engaged, and Ms. Darlene, correct me if I'm wrong, unless you are engaged in implementation, planning implementation activities, I know USD has gone back and forth with us on that. At that point in time, when school starts, you cannot use federal funds to pay salaries. And so that's a provision of the supplement, not supplant. So year zero, or
And that's why we have that 30-day limitation. Like the first 30 days, you can totally do it, provided that they are doing planning and implementation activities above and beyond what their normal job duties would be, right?
Yeah. And if
Thank you.
I can say something here, so going forward, in your financial plan, it would be really good if you can lay that out, like the CSP funding that's going to be used for the startup year and the CSP for year one, and just like Arnold said and Heather said, just lay it out so
in the notes
we know
section.
when we're doing our review, we know that okay, this amount of your CSP funding is going to be used for this purpose. And I don't know if I'm not sure. I have to get with you guys to see if there's going to be a question related to that in our protocol, or how we're going to handle that. I'm not sure about that, but I do think it would be a good idea to give as much information so it helps us. So.
Since we're talking about the CSP funds, Arnold, could you please address how much those funds are, max award per charter, and then how many years those funds are for?
Okay, really good questions. Yeah, and again, first time that we're incorporating the grant into the CSP grant application information into the application for charter. So this will be a timeline. I hate to use these words, but unlike anything we've ever seen before. So it genuinely will be different from anything that we've done. And again, the maximum award is $900,000. Whether again that's for a single campus charter or for a charter application that's submitted where they're going to open one campus in year one, and they plan to open another campus in year two and another campus in year three. It's a $900,000 flat rate maximum award per charter at the county district level, right? So what we anticipate, and it's something that we'll probably need to clarify, John and Drew, in the FAQ document, because I'm not sure that we've actually established like an end date, but I can tell you that historically, these funds would cover whatever time remains in year zero, or the startup year, or the planning period, into the first year of operations, such that the grant wouldn't end until say like July 31st after the first year of operation. So if the school opens in August of 2022, and I think that came up in another question, it's like, okay, well, these schools would be authorized sometime in this summer, early fall, and then they would be expected to open in the fall of 2022. And so we would expect the grant project period to extend at least through July of 2023, more than likely, but we may actually incorporate a longer project period. I don't think we've finalized that at this point. So, you know, again, it's going to likely be at least say a 24-month project with a start date of like where people can start potentially accessing these funds as early as October 1st of 2021. And then like I say, at least through July of 2023, we have some flexibility with this cohort of subgrantees that, you know, our grant with the department dies in 2025. So presumably we can stretch it out that long. I just don't think we want to.
Okay, Pisha, we're going to go back to you, and then Arnold, we're going to go back to you afterwards. Can you please discuss the thinking on escalation of operating cost? For example, salaries, overhead for years 2 through 5. Is there a standard such as cost of living benchmark adjustment?
Is this just for the personnel? Like,
I think it's in all
are
totality.
they asking about the raise for in salaries for the years 2, 3, 4, or
It's
I
just
don't
talking about operating cost.
operating costs?
Salaries, overhead, because in year 2, I guess they're asking, how do they escalate years?
Okay. So in your tab that says the startup year, year 1, and assumptions, there are columns that you can either increase or decrease for years going forward. So for any category, for salaries, operational costs, so if you navigate to that screen, you will find that there is a place, there are cells where you can show the increase in your costs. Does that help? Is that
I think so. I think they're wondering how to address the escalation. Like, is it caused by cost of living? I'm thinking it's going to be, you have additional students, you have additional staff, you're going to
right?
have
Yes,
additional
if you have additional
materials.
students, your revenue will also be going up. So so you would budget accordingly. And if you're hiring more staff, of course, your expenses will go up. So it's just a matter of budgeting. That's how I can explain it, but I'm not sure if that's helpful, but
We'll check this out and get back with you and post it in the FAQ.
okay.
Thank you. Arnold, can you please clarify the enrollment number suggested? Was that 250 desirable for year 1 or total enrollment? And then also, what years are CSP funds available for reimbursement? Just year 0 and year 1 or ongoing? I think you already addressed that part of it. So the 250 desirable for year 1.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily attached to the CSP grant at all. We do ask, or we have historically asked in the past in the grant application, which again used to be separate from the charter application, but we used to ask for projected enrollment numbers in year 1 and into year 2 if the grant was going to extend into year 2. There's no minimum requirement that I'm aware of in the federal statute that says you cannot award a subgrant to an entity that's serving less than X number of students. However, I think Heather has gotten into, has made mention of, financial viability and what we have historically observed at the agency in terms of schools who start out with a really, really low enrollment. They get into financial trouble pretty quickly if they don't increase that enrollment right away. We've seen that with some recent awardees of the charter, not necessarily the startup grant. So again, nothing tied to the federal statute about a minimum, but again, if you're applying for a charter, I cannot stress this enough. There should be community support. There should be community awareness. There should be outreach ongoing before the charter is ever authorized in order to support it. I mean, if you want to open a school and serve 50 kids, that's not going to cut it. I mean, we've clearly established that with previous generations of charter applications. So, I know Heather has talked to, we've had some turnover in our financial areas, but we had a financial guru with whom we used to really
I had an analyst who ran numbers to determine the minimum enrollment. And so when I talk about minimum enrollment of 250, that's going to allow you to pay your teachers to take care of the various activities that you need to as a public school. If you are under 250 students, can you operate a charter school? you are, you can operate a charter school. It's going to be very hard. You're going to need philanthropic funds to sustain you. As Arnold was saying, our experience has shown that the threshold of 250 students is something that you should aim for. We also understand that, you might not be 250 in year one, but again, that community need, interest should be driving those numbers. Opening at 50 is not viable. Opening under 50 is certainly not viable.
And the CSP grant is meant to mitigate those expenditures before you open the school, that you'll need to actually get the school up and running. But as Heather mentioned on the supplements of plant, I mean, that's why we don't allow salaries to be paid for like the first year. It's like once the school starts serving students, regardless of how many that student enrollment is, how many students are being served, the expectation now is that that foundation school program, or that FSP money that Heather mentioned during her presentation earlier, that's going to cover your your payroll expenditures and so forth. And the grant was meant to kind of just get you started. And then from that point on, your state funding or any philanthropic funding that you may receive is going to be able to get you to move beyond that point. And that's why I really hesitate to extend the CSP grant for too long, because those grant funds really should have been spent early on, in the year zero to get ready for year one, and then during year one with professional development and maybe additional equipment that wasn't purchased prior to the school opening. So we historically see a lot of that money spent pretty early on in the life of the charter school.
Okay, thank you. I think we're out of time now. Any additional questions that we have not addressed will be addressed in the FAQ document. John?
Thank you all so much for attending and sticking around with us for this long. We will follow up. For those who already left, they already got, or they'll get a survey reminder tomorrow via email. However, once this webinar ends, for those who are still on, you'll get it'll just automatically direct you to complete it. If you complete it, we would very much appreciate it. It helps us with our planning. We're really interested if this online platform works for you. With that said, thank you for attending the last Generation 26 application information session, and we will see you in January.
Thank you. Be well.